in the year 1938, for nuns disappeared without a trace. Their names were Sister Agnes, Sister Clara, Sister Therese, and Sister Mary. They were part of a small, isolated religious community that lived in a quiet, stone abbey nestled in the hills of a forgotten town. It was a kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the rituals of daily life blended with the ancient echoes of prayer and devotion. The town itself was a place untouched by the rush of modern life, where everyone knew each other and nothing much ever changed. And yet, in the midst of this peaceful world, something terrible happened, a mystery that will remain unsolved for decades. It was a summer morning when the nuns were last seen. The abbey, nestled on the edge of town, was the heart of the small religious order. The four women had been living there for years, devoted to their faith, to their daily rituals, to their prayers. They were not the kind of women who would simply walk away. Their lives were bound to the abbey, its walls, its grounds, and its mission. And yet, on that morning in 1938, they vanished. No one saw them leave. No one heard a thing. One moment, they were there, as they had always been, and the next, they were gone. At first, there was little alarm. The townspeople were used to the rhythm of life at the abbey. The nuns came and went from the town only occasionally, for supplies or visits to neighboring parishes. It wasn't unusual for them to be quiet for a few days, or for the abbey doors to remain closed. But when days turned into weeks, when there was still no sign of the nuns, the town began to murmur. Some thought they had simply gone on retreat, or had taken a sudden trip for reasons unknown. But weeks passed, then months, and still there was no word, no explanation. The absence of the four nuns, once a quiet curiosity, began to feel like something more. It was strange how, even though everyone in the town knew the abbey's history, no one asked too many questions. The abbey had always been a place of deep religious tradition and secrecy. It was an institution that demanded absolute silence, obedience, and devotion from its inhabitants, but also a place where the line between the sacred and the sinister seemed to blur. Many of the townspeople had grown up hearing whispered rumors about the abbey's past. Strange happenings, unexplained events, and even stories about the abbey's founders that were never fully understood. But the nuns? They were different. They were respected, loved even. The disappearance of the four nuns was unsettling, but the town had learned to move on. People in small towns often do. And so, the years passed. The mystery of the vanished nuns was tucked away into the crevices of the town's collective memory. Some townsfolk spoke of the nuns only in hushed tones, as if their names were somehow sacred, untouchable. Others simply forgot about them entirely. Life continued. People moved, grew older, had children, and forgot about the small oddities in the past that had never been fully explained. But there were a few who never forgot. There were a few who still carried the question in their hearts. Even as the years turned into decades, why had the nuns disappeared? Where had they gone? What had happened to them? The abbey remained there, its stone walls worn by time, its windows dark and uninviting. It stood as a quiet monument to a mystery that lingered unanswered in the air. Then, in the 1980s, something happened that would reopen the door to this long-forgotten mystery. Renovations. The abbey, now in need of repair, was going to undergo a significant restoration. The town had grown, and with it, the desire to preserve its historical landmarks. The abbey, with its old stone walls and ancient architecture, was a piece of living history, and it was time to restore it. Workers began to tear down the crumbling walls, clear away the debris, and replace rotting timbers. It was supposed to be a routine job, one that would breathe new life into the old structure, and yet it became the moment when everything changed. As the renovation crew worked inside the abbey, they began to remove the plaster that covered the walls surrounding the choir. It was a routine task, something that had been done hundreds of times in other buildings. But when they reached a particular section of the wall, they found something unexpected, a hidden compartment. Behind the wall, there was a small, sealed-off room. It wasn't large, just a few feet wide, but the discovery felt like a sudden punch to the gut. What could possibly be hidden there? The workers, unaware of the significance of the room, continued their work. But something about this room felt different. Something about it felt wrong. As they pried open the hidden space, their eyes widened in shock. Inside, they found old, forgotten relics, belongings that seem out of place for a building of such religious significance, personal items, clothing, and, more disturbing still, remnants of human life that hinted at something darker, something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The room wasn't empty. It had been lived in. It had been sealed off, hidden away from the rest of the abbey for reasons no one could yet understand. The walls, once covered in layers of dust and grime, seemed to come alive with the discovery. Each piece of clothing, each object told a story of someone who had once been there, of someone who had once lived in that very room, but had disappeared from sight. The workers, taken aback by the discovery, immediately stopped their work. They didn't know it yet, but what they had stumbled upon would turn the town upside down. The truth, it seemed, was about to be uncovered, and it was a truth far darker than anyone had imagined. But before that truth could be fully understood, the discovery of the room began to ripple through the town. Word spread quickly, as it always did in a small place like this. The once-forgotten mystery of the 4 missing nuns suddenly became something real, something tangible. The truth, it seemed, had been hidden right in front of them all along, and now it was coming to light. For the townspeople, the discovery of that hidden room opened up a floodgate of questions. What had happened to the nuns? Why had their belongings been hidden away? What had the abbey been keeping from them? Had the nuns truly disappeared, or had they been deliberately concealed? No one knew for sure. Everyone knew that the answers they were about to uncover would change everything. But the real question that lingered in the air, unspoken yet understood, was why the abbey had hidden the truth for so long. What had been buried, not just in the walls of the building, but in the hearts and minds of the people who had lived there for so many years. Could the past ever truly be forgotten, or was it always waiting, just beneath the surface, to come to light? It was in this moment, at the intersection of history and memory, that the mystery began to take shape. The truth, it seemed, was something much more complex than anyone had ever imagined, and as the workers stood in that small hidden room, they had no idea that they were about to uncover a secret that had been locked away for nearly 50 years. The 4 nuns had vanished, but they had never truly disappeared. The truth, it seemed, had always been hiding behind the walls of the abbey, waiting to be found. And as the workers stared into the dark, sealed-off room, they knew, instinctively, that they were about to uncover something that would haunt them forever. The abbey stood, as it had for centuries, an imposing structure of stone and silence, its walls thick with the weight of history, a quiet fortress nestled in the rolling hills. Far from the noise of the world, it had been a place of peace for those who sought refuge within its boundaries. The nuns who lived there were not just caretakers of the abbey, but also guardians of its sanctity. Their lives were simple, disciplined, and structured. Every day was marked by prayers, chores, and reflection. Their lives were measured not by the hours that passed, but by the liturgical rhythms that governed their existence. Morning prayers, midday meditation, evening vespers, and then sleep, only to begin again with the first light of dawn. To outsiders, the abbey was a mysterious place, wrapped in its own world. People rarely visited, and when they did, they were met with cool, polite hospitality, but an unmistakable sense of distance. It was a place where the outside world seemed to lose its relevance. The nuns lived apart, not just physically but emotionally, their hearts tethered to a higher calling, one that was not meant to be shared with the world beyond the gates. For those who lived there, the abbey was more than a building. It was a home, a refuge, a sacred space where the distractions of modern life could not reach them. But within the walls of the abbey, there was a quiet isolation that bordered on the unnatural. While the town outside moved with the flow of seasons, the abbey seemed to exist outside of time. It was as though the world had forgotten the abbey's existence, leaving it to stand as a monument to something ancient and eternal. The nuns who lived there were part of this timeless ritual, bound not just to the abbey itself, but to the traditions and the sacred silence that had defined the order for generations. They followed the rules handed down to them with reverence, never questioning, never seeking to break from the life they had been given. The nuns were of different ages, backgrounds, and personalities, but they were all united by one thing: their devotion to their faith. Sister Agnes, the eldest, was a woman of great wisdom. Her eyes were kind, but there was a depth to them that spoke of years spent in contemplation, Years spent searching for answers that only God could provide. Sister Clara was younger, with a quiet, introspective nature. She often wandered the grounds, lost in thought, her gaze distant, as if her mind was constantly drifting toward some faraway place. Sister Therese was practical and steadfast, her feet firmly planted in the world. She believed in the work of her hands and the peace that came from a job well done. Sister Mary, the youngest of the four, was the most idealistic. She had entered the abbey with the hope of finding something greater than herself, and it was her idealism that had often led her to question the world beyond the walls. Each of the four women had their own path, their own reasons for choosing the life they had, but they all shared the same devotion to the abbey and its sacred mission. Their days followed a steady rhythm, a cycle of prayer and work. The abbey itself was a labyrinth of quiet hallways, dimly lit rooms, and hidden corners where time seemed to stand still. The walls were adorned with faded tapestries, depicting scenes from the Bible, and the air was thick with the scent of incense and the sound of whispered prayers. The nuns spent their days tending to the abbey's gardens, cleaning the stone floors, preparing meals, and most importantly, praying. It was a life of simplicity, but also one of profound purpose. The outside world had no place here. It was as if the nuns had chosen to live in a separate world, a world where only the divine existed and everything else was secondary. But within that world, there was an unsettling stillness, a quiet that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a silence that was sometimes comforting, sometimes suffocating. The abbey was a place of peace, yes, but it was also a place where the shadows of the past lingered, waiting to be acknowledged. There were rumors, faint whispers passed down to the years, of strange occurrences, unexplained sounds, and shadows that moved in the corners of the rooms. It was as if the abbey itself held secrets that no one dared confront, and the nuns, though devoted to their lives of prayer, were not immune to the weight of those secrets. They were human, after all, and even in the sacred silence of the abbey, the mind could wander, could question. But there was no room for such doubts, no space for questioning in a place so firmly anchored in tradition. As the years passed, the abbey began to show signs of age. The once pristine gardens grew wild and overgrown. The stones of the building began to crack and weather, and the roof began to leak. But despite its decline, the abbey retained an air of quiet dignity. It was as though the building, like the nuns themselves, had become a relic of another time, a time when the world was simpler, less complicated, when faith alone was enough to sustain a person. The nuns, despite their aging bodies and the wear of the years, continued to tend to the abbey with the same dedication they had shown when they first arrived. But there were days when the weight of the years seemed too much, when their devotion was tested not by the world around them, but by the silence of the abbey itself. It was this silence, perhaps, that began to weigh on the nuns, especially as the years drew on. The quiet, which had once been comforting, began to feel oppressive. It was a silence that stretched beyond the walls of the abbey and seeped into the hearts of those who lived there. It was as if the building, the very air they breathed, was holding something back. The four nuns, in their own ways, began to sense that something was amiss, that something was not quite right within the abbey. The older nuns tried to dismiss these feelings, telling themselves that the peace of their lives was simply a reflection of their devotion. But for the younger nuns, particularly Sister Mary, the silence became increasingly unbearable. She would wander the grounds late at night, unable to sleep, her mind filled with strange thoughts that she couldn't explain. She felt a pull, a sense of something hidden, something waiting to be uncovered. Despite these feelings, the nuns continued with their work, their prayers, their duties. They kept to their routines, believing that if they stayed true to the sacred rhythm of their lives, they would be protected from whatever darkness lingered within the abbey. But the sense of unease only grew, especially as the nuns grew older. The older women began to slow down, their steps less sure, their hands more unsteady. Sister Therese, once so practical, began to forget small tasks. Sister Agnes, with her deep wisdom, became more distant, her eyes clouded with something no one could understand. Only Sister Mary, the youngest, still held on to hope that the peace she saw could be found in the prayers and rituals that surrounded her. Then, on the morning of the four nuns' disappearance, something shifted. It was a quiet shift, so subtle that no one would have noticed at first. The air felt different, as if something were about to break. The nuns had spent the night in prayer, as was their custom, but when morning arrived, they were gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that they had been taken against their will. Their rooms were undisturbed. The beds were made. The doors were locked. They had simply vanished. It was as if they had stepped into the very air of the abbey, only to dissolve into it. No one could say where they had gone or why. They were simply gone, as if erased from the world. For those who remained, there was a haunting question that followed them every day. What happened to the nuns? Had they left on their own, as some speculated? Had they somehow disappeared into the very fabric of the abbey, swallowed up by the silence that had once kept them safe? Or had something darker, something far more sinister, taken them? As the years passed, the mystery of the vanished nuns was buried, left to fade into corners of memory. The town moved on, as towns do, but for those who had known the nuns, the question lingered unanswered, haunting them in the quiet spaces where the abbey's silence had once seemed peaceful but now felt oppressive. When the nuns first disappeared, there was an eerie sense of calm that followed. The town, a place where gossip spread like wildfire, seemed unusually silent in the days after the four women vanished. It was as though the whole town collectively held its breath, unsure what to say or do. People walked about their routines, heads down, trying to push the uncomfortable truth aside. At first, there was no outcry, no frantic search. The question of what happened to them seemed almost secondary to the immediate, almost instinctual desire to pretend that nothing had really happened. After all, in a town so small, where everyone knew each other, where the walls of the abbey had been as familiar as one's own home, the absence of the nuns should have been a glaring alarm. But somehow it wasn't. It wasn't that the townspeople didn't care, but they'd been taught over the years to accept the rhythms of the abbey's strange isolation. The nuns had always kept to themselves, their lives marked by a sense of duty that bordered on the obsessive. Their presence in the town was minimal, only ever venturing into the village for supplies or special events. They were known, yes, but they were also almost like ghosts, mere whispers in the background of life. And so, when they vanished, it was not immediately alarming. It felt, in some strange way, like something that was destined to happen, something inevitable, as though the abbey's very existence was always meant to hold its secrets close. The town had always known that something was off about the abbey. Though no one dared speak aloud, there was an undercurrent of unease that ran through the village. The abbey was a place of quiet devotion, but it was also a place of mystery, a place that held an air of exclusion. It was a place where the outside world had little claim. There were rumors, of course, whispers about the abbey's history, the strange rituals that the nuns followed, the curious manner in which they seemed untouched by the world's changes. But these were just stories, bits of folklore that people passed down to the generations, to be laughed at and dismissed when daylight returned. The reality was that no one really knew what went on within those walls. No one had ever bothered to find out. It was simply accepted that the abbey and its inhabitants were beyond understanding and therefore beyond questioning. The missing nuns, at first, seemed no different. It wasn't unusual, after all, for them to go into seclusion, to spend days in silence and prayer away from the prying eyes of the world. It was their way. So when days passed and no one had seen them, the town, as if guided by an invisible force, simply carried on. There were no organized searches, no calls to the authorities, no attempt to understand what had truly happened. The town's collective memory, so often dictated by the present, quickly shoved the nuns' absence into the recesses of its mind. But as weeks turned into months, something started to shift. The unease, which had initially been so quiet, began to spread like a slow-burning fire. People started to talk, if only in hushed tones. "Have you heard?" they would whisper, their voices tinged with doubt. The nuns haven't been seen for months. And yet, no one seemed willing to confront the real question. What happened to them? It wasn't long before the story of the missing nuns began to fade into the backdrop of life in the town, swallowed up by the mundane and the everyday. There were other things to think about: work, family, the seasons changing. People had their lives to live, and the mystery, however unsettling, was too far removed from their own personal struggles to demand attention. As the months passed and the town's eyes moved on, the story of the nuns quietly disappeared from conversations. Just another unsolved mystery in a world filled with too many unanswered questions. But then, there were the few who could not, or would not, forget. These were the ones who still felt the weight of the absence, the ones who couldn't help but look over their shoulders, as if waiting for something to be revealed, for the truth to finally come to light. The old men and women who had watched the nuns walk past their houses each day, their eyes sharp with memories of the past. The children who had once been taught by them, who still whispered their names in the corners of their minds. And there were others, those who lived in the shadow of the abbey itself, who could feel the weight of its silent gaze pressing down on them. For these people, the missing nuns were never fully gone. Their disappearance gnawed at them, even if they couldn't put words to it. At first, the questions were subtle, almost imperceptible. It started with a strange sense of déjà vu. People thought they'd seen one of the nuns walking along the edge of the road, only to look again and realize that it was someone else. It was as though the nuns had never truly left, as if they were still lingering on the edges of town, just beyond reach. Their presence seemed to haunt the town, a memory that wouldn't fade. And then there were the odd occurrences, stories told by travelers passing through, of strange lights in the windows of the abbey at night, long after the townsfolk had gone to sleep. And still, no one did anything. The mystery of the missing nuns was never brought into the light, never examined or explored. It became a quiet, unspoken wound in the town's history. Those who had known the nuns, the ones who had known them best, began to question if there was more to the story than they had been told. Had the nuns simply gone away, disappeared into the world without a trace, or had something else happened? Something darker, perhaps something that the town wasn't ready to face. And so, for years, the questions lingered unanswered. No one spoke openly about the missing nuns, but everyone felt the weight of their absence. It was as though the town itself had tacitly agreed to forget, to erase them from memory as though their lives had never mattered. Yet in the silence, the questions persisted, growing louder with each passing year. What had happened to the nuns? Where had they gone? The town's reluctance to confront the mystery was not out of malice or disregard. It was simply the way things worked in places like this. People learned to live with the unexplained, to accept the mysteries of life that didn't have easy answers. No one was brave enough, or perhaps no one cared enough, to investigate further. It wasn't until decades later, when renovations were scheduled to begin at the abbey, that anyone would dare to search for answers. The decision to renovate the abbey came from outside the town, an effort to preserve the building and its history for future generations. The town had grown over the years, and there were now tourists, curious visitors eager to see the abbey's ancient walls. But for the people who had lived in the town their whole lives, it was an unsettling decision. There were memories, old memories, tied to that place. The idea of tearing down walls and digging to the abbey's history felt invasive, as if the past, specifically the part of the past that had been quietly buried, was about to be disturbed. It wasn't until the workmen arrived and began their task that the first real clue emerged. They were simply doing their jobs, removing plaster, stripping away layers of decay. But as they dug deeper into the abbey structure, they uncovered something unexpected, something hidden. And in that moment, the town's silent agreement to leave the past in the past was irrevocably broken. The mystery that had been ignored, overlooked, and buried for so long was about to come to the surface. And no one, not even the most curious of the townspeople, could have imagined the horrors that would follow. The abbey had always been a place of secrets, though no one could say exactly what those secrets were. It was the sort of place that, with its ancient stone walls and quiet, echoing halls, seemed to hold its own mysteries, locked away from the world outside. The abbey, both a fortress and a sanctuary, had been built to withstand the passage of time, and it did so with an eerie, almost oppressive silence. Generations of nuns had come and gone, each living out their lives within its cold, sacred walls, each adding a layer to the story of the abbey that no one ever seemed to fully understand. The stories were passed on, whispered from one nun to the next, but no one spoke of them openly, and few ever questioned them. The abbey was a place of devotion and obedience, but it was also a place where the outside world did not intrude. And as long as the nuns stayed true to their vows, there was no reason to dig deeper, to look too closely. But that all began to change when the renovation started. The abbey had been deteriorating for years. Its walls cracked, its roof leaked, its once beautiful stained glass windows faded and shattered. The abbey, though still a place of sanctuary, was showing the wear and tear of age, and so the decision was made to restore it. The town, now expanded and modernized, had grown distant from its past. The abbey, a remnant of a time long gone, was an artifact, a relic of history. Tourists were now beginning to visit, drawn by the mystique of the abbey and its stories. And so, the decision was made to restore it, to bring it back to its former glory. The renovation team was a group of workers, ordinary men, many of them from the surrounding areas, who had little interest in the abbey's history. They came with their tools and their plans, ready to strip away the layers of neglect and bring the abbey back to life. They had no idea that, in the process of their work, they would uncover something that would shatter the quiet facade of the abbey and expose the buried truths that had been locked away for so long. The first day of work was like any other, and the workers did their best to stay focused on the task at hand. They had been given specific instructions to begin with the choir room, a space that had been neglected for decades. The floorboards had begun to creak under the weight of time, and the walls, once adorned with religious murals, had begun to peel and flake. As they began their work, the crew members noticed something strange. A section of the wall seemed to have been sealed off, hidden behind a thick layer of plaster. It wasn't unusual for a building of this age to have hidden spaces, secret rooms, or passages. But something about this particular section of the wall caught their attention. The plaster seemed to have been placed deliberately, as though it were meant to conceal something. Curiosity began to stir among the workers. They had come to the abbey to perform their tasks, not to dig into the past. But this section of the wall seemed different. They decided to investigate further. The workers began carefully chipping away at the plaster, trying to uncover whatever was hidden behind it. It was slow work, and as the minutes turned into hours, the anticipation in the air grew. What could be behind that wall? A secret passage? An old storage space? Or something more? They could not know yet, but the sense that they were on the verge of uncovering something important, something that had been hidden for decades, grew with each stroke of their hammers. Then, with a final, resounding thud, the plaster gave way, revealing a small, narrow space behind it. The workers stared in disbelief. At first, it looked like nothing more than a shallow alcove, a dusty and forgotten corner of the abbey. But as they cleared away the debris and stepped closer, they began to make out the outlines of objects, belongings, items that did not belong in such a hidden place. They found pieces of clothing, old and tattered, some of which looked as though they had been hastily discarded. There were religious texts, stained with age, their pages curling at the edges. There were small, personal items, a comb, a faded photograph, a worn rosary. And then, most unsettling of all, they found a small wooden box, intricately carved, that had been placed carefully in the corner of the room. It looked like it had been left there with purpose, as if someone had meant for it to be found. But not yet. The air in the room shifted. What had started as an ordinary renovation project was now something entirely different. The workers, though used to finding remnants of the past in the walls of old buildings, had never seen anything like this. The feeling that they had stumbled upon something they were not meant to find settled heavily over them. They stood in that small, dark room, surrounded by relics of the past, and for a moment, none of them spoke. The silence was oppressive, as though the room itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They quickly alerted the authorities, and soon after, a small team of historians and local experts arrived to assess the discovery. They began cataloging the items found in the room, taking photographs and making notes. The nuns, they soon realized, had not simply vanished into thin air. They had left something behind. The items were undeniably theirs. The clothing, though old and worn, still bore the marks of their order. The rosary was unmistakable, a symbol of their faith. And the photograph, though faded and nearly illegible, depicted the four women, their faces young and full of life. The picture seemed to have been taken during a time when they had first arrived at the abbey, full of hope and devotion. But the photograph also seemed to hold something more, an unspoken message, an eerie sense of forewarning. The room itself was not just a storage space, but a hidden place, a room that had been sealed off from the rest of the abbey. The more the historians and experts examined the space, the more they began to question why it had been concealed for so long. The items left behind were not just relics of the nuns' daily lives. They were clues, pieces of a puzzle that had been deliberately kept out of sight. The wooden box, still unopened, seemed to hold the key to something much deeper, a secret that had been buried, hidden away by someone or something within the abbey. The emotional weight of the discovery settled in slowly, but powerfully. The nuns had not just disappeared. They had been hidden. The room in which their belongings had been stored was a deliberate concealment, a place where their existence had been erased, almost as if they had been erased from the abbey's history altogether. The question that followed was inevitable. Why? Why had the nuns been hidden away? And why had it taken so long for anyone to find out? As the discovery continued to unfold, it became clear that the answers would not come easily. The more the team dug into the history of the abbey, the more questions arose. Why had the abbey, a place dedicated to faith and piety, held such a dark secret? Had the nuns been kept in that room against their will? Were they silenced for reasons no one had ever been told? And why had no one asked questions for so long? The town, it seemed, had been complicit in the silence, choosing to look away, to forget. But now the truth was coming to the surface, and it was undeniable. The hidden room, though small and seemingly insignificant at first, became a symbol of something much larger, a symbol of the buried truths that lay hidden behind the walls of the abbey. It was a place that had been forgotten, ignored, and now uncovered. And as the box was finally opened, revealing its contents, the workers, historians, and authorities began to realize that the mystery of the missing nuns was not just a question of disappearance. It was a question of what had been hidden from them all along. The box contained more than just personal items. It held letters, written in trembling handwriting, filled with cryptic messages and references to events that had never been explained. It held a diary, one of the nuns' own, its pages filled with thoughts of fear and regret, as though the writer had known something terrible was about to unfold. There were references to secret meetings, to things that had been kept hidden from the rest of the town, things that no one had ever dared to speak of, and among these pages was a chilling realization. The nuns had not just disappeared. They had been part of something much darker, something that had been buried deep within the abbey, waiting for someone to uncover it. The wooden box, its surface smooth yet worn with age, was the key to unraveling the enigma of the missing nuns. It had sat undisturbed for decades, hidden in a forgotten alcove behind a wall that had long since been sealed, waiting for the right hands to reveal its contents. As the workers gently pried it open, there was an air of reverence, as if they had been entrusted with something sacred. Inside the box were items that spoke volumes about lives once lived, of rituals and routines. But there was also a heavy weight in the air, a sense that something far darker was being unearthed. The first item that was pulled from the box was a set of faded, yellowed letters. They were carefully folded, their edges curled and torn, as though they had been hastily hidden away. The handwriting was elegant, though shaky, as if written under duress. The letters were addressed to no one in particular, but each one carried the same thread of fear and anxiety. The nun's handwriting, so delicate and precise, was filled with phrases that suggested a deep unease, something unseen but palpably real. The tone was not one of peace or quiet contemplation, as one might expect from religious figures. Rather, it hinted at an internal turmoil that had festered over the years. The letters spoke of whispered voices in the dark, of shadows that seemed to move when no one was around, of strange occurrences within the abbey that no one dared to address. One letter, written by Sister Agnes, the eldest of the four, mentioned something inexplicable happening late one evening. "I heard a noise," the letter read, "not the noise of the wind or the creaking of the old stones, but something far worse, something that shouldn't be here. The abbey has secrets, and I fear they are not meant to remain hidden much longer." There was a clear sense of dread in the words, as if Sister Agnes had already known what was coming but had been powerless to stop it. Another letter, this one from Sister Mary, the youngest, revealed a different side of the story. She spoke of her growing disillusionment with the abbey, of her dreams filled with images of people who had long since passed, of visions that seemed to hint at a deeper truth. "I feel as though I am not alone," Sister Mary wrote. "I walk through the halls and hear the whispers of those who came before us. It's as though the abbey is alive, and it is not a benign life. It speaks, but only in riddles. The words were haunting in their innocence, as if a young woman on the brink of spiritual awakening had encountered something so disturbing that it shattered her sense of reality. As the letters were carefully read and analyzed, it became clear that the nuns had not simply disappeared. There was something that had pushed them to the edge of their world, something that had made them retreat into the hidden corners of the abbey, to seal themselves off from everything and everyone. But what had that something been? The fear that had been expressed in their letters was not merely abstract. It had a source, an origin. It was a fear rooted in something tangible, something they had witnessed, or perhaps something they had become a part of. Then there was the diary. The soft, leather-bound journal was another piece of the puzzle, and it was immediately clear that it had been kept by one of the nuns, most likely Sister Therese, the most practical and steadfast of the group. The pages were filled with long, flowing passages about the mundane tasks of the day, washing linens, preparing meals, cleaning the chapel. But beneath the surface, the entries revealed a growing unease. Sister Therese, though seemingly pragmatic, had begun to document her increasingly disturbing thoughts. She wrote of feeling watched, of hearing strange noises in the night, and of an inexplicable sensation that someone, was lurking just beyond her sight. She even began to write about her dreams, vivid and unsettling dreams that seemed to offer glimpses into a reality far darker than anything she could have imagined. "Last night, I dreamt of an old woman," she wrote. "Her face was pale, her eyes empty. She spoke to me without words, and though I did not understand, I felt her presence in every bone of my body. She was waiting, and so was I." There were also more cryptic entries, ones that hinted at something much deeper, something more sinister. "The abbey is hiding something." One entry read, "I feel in the stones. It is not just a building. It is a tomb, and I fear that I am the one who is meant to be buried in it." The sense of foreboding in Sister Theresa's words was undeniable, and it left a haunting echo in the air as the team pored over the pages. What had she meant by a tomb? What did she fear was buried within the abbey, waiting to claim her? Along with the letters in the diary, the box also contained a series of small, personal items, tokens of the nuns' lives before they arrived at the abbey. There were old photographs, some of the nuns as young women, full of hope and promise, and others showing them as they were in their final years at the abbey, tired, distant, and worn. There was a rosary, its beads frayed from years of use, and a collection of religious trinkets, some of which were unfamiliar, their meanings lost to time. But it was not the items themselves that were most disturbing. It was a sense of deliberate concealment, the care with which they had been hidden, tucked away in a room that no one was meant to find. The discovery of the box, along with its contents, opened a door that had long been sealed, and with it came a flood of questions that no one could have anticipated. Why had these personal items been hidden away in such a secretive manner? Had the nuns known something they hadn't shared with the rest of the world? What had they feared? And perhaps most chilling of all, what had caused their eventual disappearance? As the box was examined further, the sense of unease among the historians and investigators grew. They began to realize that the nuns had not simply vanished. They had been driven to do so. Something had pushed them into hiding, into a space where no one could find them, not even the faithful who relied on the abbey for their prayers and solace. The questions only multiplied as the mystery deepened. What had been happening in the abbey that the nuns had become so terrified? Was there a force at work, some presence, that had driven them to seclude themselves from the world? At the same time, there was an undeniable shift in the town's collective mindset. As the truth about the missing nuns began to surface, the townspeople were forced to confront a reality they had long ignored. The abbey, once a place of revered tradition, now seemed to hold a far darker history than anyone had ever realized. The town's quiet complicity in the mystery was suddenly exposed, and the sense of guilt was palpable. People began to wonder if they had known more than they had let on, if they, too, had ignored the whispers about strange occurrences, or worse, if they had brushed aside the very real fear that had existed within the walls of the abbey. The hidden room, the sealed-off space where the nuns had hidden their belongings, became a symbol of the secrets that had been kept, of the truths that had been buried. It was no longer just an old, abandoned part of the abbey. It was a doorway into the unknown, a key that unlocked the past and revealed the hidden fears of the women who had once lived there. But as the investigators pieced together the contents of the box, a deeper, more chilling question began to emerge. Was the truth that they were uncovering the full truth? Or had something far darker been kept hidden, not just from them, but from everyone? The nuns had gone missing, and in their absence, the abbey had remained locked in its silent, unsettling stillness. But now, as the box was opened and its contents revealed, the silence was no longer the same. It was as though the abbey itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. What had happened to the nuns? And what had been hidden, buried so deep within the abbey's walls, that it had taken decades for anyone to uncover it? The mystery of the missing nuns was no longer just a simple case of disappearance. It was the beginning of something much larger, something that reached into the darkest corners of the abbey's history and its own hidden past. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, but the truth was still just out of reach. And as the box sat open, its contents spilling out into the light, the town could no longer ignore the terrifying reality that something had been concealed within the abbey for far too long. The search for answers had only just begun, but it was clear that the road ahead would be a long and harrowing one. As the workers and investigators sifted through the contents of the box, an unsettling realization began to take hold. The nuns had been hiding from something. The box itself was not merely a collection of personal effects. It was a carefully guarded secret, hidden behind a wall, tucked away in an isolated part of the abbey. The box was meant to stay hidden, its contents concealed from the world. And as the investigators continued to examine the items inside, they realized that the nuns had known something that had driven them into hiding, something that had forced them to abandon the very vows of peace and silence they had sworn to uphold. The unsettling question remained: what had driven them to disappear? What had led them to hide away in the search for answers led deeper into the heart of the abbey, and as each layer was peeled back, the sense of something unsettling grew ever stronger. The walls, it seemed, were filled with echoes of a history long forgotten. Whispers had been buried beneath centuries of prayers and rituals. Each stone, each shadow, held secrets that had remained hidden not just from the world, but from the very people who had lived there, the nuns themselves. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the nuns had been caught in a web of mystery, one that had entangled their lives in ways no one had ever imagined. The letters, the diary, and the personal items had given the investigators a glimpse into the nuns' lives, but they had only scratched the surface. The deeper the investigation went, the more questions arose. The discovery of the hidden room had been startling, but it was just the beginning. It was the revelations within the abbey itself, the very walls that had once offered solace, that seemed to hold the key to understanding what had happened to the four nuns. Each room, each hallway, had been carefully examined, and though there was no obvious evidence of foul play or violence, there was an overwhelming sense of something unseen, something wrong. The walls of the abbey seemed to hum with an energy that defied explanation. It was as though the very structure of the building had absorbed something over the years, something dark, something that could no longer be contained. As the investigators pressed forward, they turned their attention to the abbey's long and mysterious history. It became clear that the building itself was not just a place of worship. It was a place where something had been buried, something far older than the nuns, something that had remained hidden for generations. The abbey had been built on land with a long and shadowy past, a history that stretched back long before the first stone of the abbey had been laid. In the centuries before the abbey's construction, the land had been a site of pagan rituals, of dark rites that had been practiced under the cover of night. It was said that the ancient stones of the land had absorbed the energy of those rituals, the blood and sacrifice of those who had come before. But with the rise of Christianity, the land had been transformed, the rituals replaced with prayers and hymns, the dark past buried beneath layers of new stone and faith. Yet, despite the passing of centuries, it seemed that the land's past could not be erased. The abbey, with its quiet, sacred air, had become a place where the past lingered, a place where old wounds had never truly healed. The nuns, in their innocence and faith, had been unaware of the ancient darkness that lay beneath the abbey's walls. They had come to the abbey with their own fears, their own devotions, never suspecting that they were entering a place that had once been the site of blood and shadow. But as the years passed, the building began to show signs that something was amiss. The strange occurrences that the nuns had written about in their letters, The eerie whispers, the shadowy figures, the feeling of being watched were not just figments of their imagination. They were a reflection of the land itself, of the ancient power that still clung to the stones. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the nuns had been exposed to something far more sinister than they had realized. The dreams, the feelings of being watched, the growing unease, all of these things were tied to something that had existed long before their arrival. It was not simply a matter of the abbey being old. It was a matter of the land itself being cursed, of the very foundation of the abbey being built upon something that should never have been disturbed. The strange occurrences, the sense of foreboding, had been a result of something ancient awakening beneath their feet. The nuns had been drawn into a web of darkness that had been spun long before they arrived, and they had no choice but to try to navigate its tangled threads. The mystery deepened when the investigators discovered a series of old documents hidden deep within the abbey's archives. These papers, yellow with age and fragile to the touch, told a story that had been lost to history. They spoke of an ancient order, one that had existed long before the nuns had arrived, a group of people who had once lived on the land and practiced rituals that were forbidden by the church. This order had been devoted to something far darker than faith, something that had been passed down through generations. The documents detailed the rituals that had been performed, the sacrifices that had been made, and the price that had been paid to keep the land's power at bay. It seemed that the land itself had been a conduit, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin, a place where the boundaries of reality could be bent. And it was this power that had never been fully erased, no matter how hard the church had tried. The deeper the investigators delved into these records, the more they began to see a pattern that suggested that the nuns had been caught in a struggle that had been going on for centuries. The rituals, the ceremonies, the strange happenings within the abbey. It was all part of something much larger, something that had been set into motion long before the nuns had arrived. And now, in the quiet halls of the abbey, it seemed that the past was coming alive once more. The shadows that had lingered in the corners of the abbey were not just figments of the nuns' imaginations. They were echoes of something far older, something that had been left behind, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The discovery of the old order's documents was just the beginning. The investigators continued to search the abbey, uncovering hidden chambers and long-forgotten passageways. It was as though the abbey itself was hiding something, unwilling to reveal all of its secrets. The more they searched, the more they began to realize that the abbey had been constructed with hidden compartments, rooms that were deliberately concealed, places that were meant to be kept in the dark. It was as though the builders had known that something needed to be hidden away, something that had to be kept buried for as long as possible. And the deeper the investigators dug, the more they realized that the nuns had been swept into a much larger and more dangerous struggle, one that had been unfolding for centuries, a struggle that had been buried beneath the surface of the abbey's sacred walls. The investigation into the nuns' disappearance soon turned into something much more than anyone had anticipated. It was no longer just about finding out where the nuns had gone. It was about uncovering the truth about the abbey, about the land on which it stood, and about the dark history that had been concealed for so long. The nuns had not just vanished. They had been drawn into a battle for control of something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The fear that had filled their letters, the terror that had haunted their dreams, was not just personal. It was a reaction to the ancient power that had been waiting to be awakened. As the investigators uncovered more and more about the abbey's hidden history, they began to piece together the final puzzle. The nuns had been exposed to something they could not understand, something that had been buried beneath the abbey for centuries. They had been the latest in a long line of people who had fallen victim to the dark power that resided in the land. The strange events, the whispers in the night, the shadows, they were not mere hallucinations. They were the result of an ancient force that had been waiting for the right moment to break free. The nuns had been caught in its grip, unable to escape, trapped in a struggle between light and darkness that had been unfolding for centuries. The final piece of the puzzle came when investigators uncovered an old journal belonging to one of the original founders of the abbey. This journal, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand, spoke of a secret pact, a deal made long ago to keep the land's power at bay. It seemed that the abbey had not been built just as a place of worship. It had been built as a prison, a means of containing the dark force that had once held sway over the land. The nuns had appeared, had unknowingly become the latest guardians of that secret. And when they had begun to uncover the truth, when they had begun to understand the depth of the darkness that lay beneath the abbey, they had been forced to make a choice: face the terror head-on or disappear into shadows, never to be heard from again. The nuns had chosen the latter. They had sealed themselves away, hidden from the world, in an attempt to protect everyone around them. But in doing so, they had also become part of the very darkness they had tried to escape. The walls of the abbey, once a place of peace, had become a prison, holding not just the nuns but also the terrifying truth about the land itself. The mystery of their disappearance was not just a matter of their physical absence. It was a reflection of something far more profound, something that had been hidden for centuries and which had now come to light. And as the last secrets of the abbey were finally uncovered, it became clear that the truth about the missing nuns was not one that anyone could easily accept. It was a truth that would change everything, and once it had been revealed, nothing would ever be the same again. As the mystery of the missing nuns continued to unfold, the very fabric of the abbey seemed to tremble, as if the building itself was resisting the revelations that were being unearthed. The truth, once hidden behind centuries of silence, was now clawing its way to the surface, and with each passing day, the investigators felt the weight of it growing heavier. The deeper they dug into the past, the more they realized that the abbey, far from being a sanctuary, was a place deeply tied to the darkest forces that had never truly been eradicated, merely buried beneath layers of time, faith, and ritual. It was becoming painfully clear that the nuns' disappearance was no accident. It was part of a much larger, more terrifying narrative, one that stretched back centuries and was intricately linked to the very foundation of the abbey itself. The land on which the abbey stood had always been considered sacred, a place blessed by God and protected by the church. But as the investigation deepened, it became clear that this supposed sanctity had been merely a veneer, a mask that had concealed a far older and more dangerous power. The documents discovered in the hidden archives, the old journals and letters, all spoke of this force, a force that had existed long before Christianity had taken root on the land, a force that predated the abbey by centuries. The builders of the abbey, it seemed, had known about this power. They had not only chosen the site because of its spiritual significance, but also because it was a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin. The abbey had been built atop a well of ancient energy, a place where rituals had once been performed, sacrifices made, and blood spilled to keep the dark forces at bay. And it was this very power that had been disturbed when the nuns arrived, unknowingly walking into a storm that had been brewing for centuries. The investigators, now fully immersed in the abbey's history, began to piece together a picture that was both terrifying and heartbreaking. The nuns, they realized, had not just been victims of their own faith. They had been drawn into something far more insidious. They had been caught in the crossfire of an ongoing battle between light and dark, a battle that had been fought long before their time. But what was most chilling was the realization that the nuns had been chosen to play a part in this battle, whether they had understood it or not. They were not mere inhabitants of the abbey. They were its unwilling guardians, its protectors, bound by a duty they had never asked for. And when they had begun to uncover the truth about the abbey's dark past, when they had started to see the shadows that moved just out of sight, they had been forced to make an impossible choice: fight against the darkness and risk their lives, or retreat into hiding and hope that it would pass them by. The decision they had made, sealing themselves away, hiding in the very walls they had once called home, had been their only way of protecting the town and the people they had sworn to serve. But even in their seclusion, the nuns could not escape the power that lay beneath the abbey. The strange occurrences they had written about, the whispers they had heard, the shadows they had seen moving in the corners of their vision, these were not figments of their imagination. They were manifestations of the dark force that had always been present, lurking just beneath the surface. And as the years passed, this force began to grow stronger, feeding off the fear and isolation of the nuns, becoming more and more difficult to contain. The nuns had not simply disappeared. They had been drawn into the abyss, swallowed by the very darkness they had tried to escape. The documents uncovered by the investigators suggested that the abbey's founders had made a pact, a desperate attempt to bind the dark force that resided within the land. They had created rituals, prayers, and protections designed to keep the power at bay, but they had always known that the danger was never truly gone. The rituals had been performed in secret, away from the eyes of the outside world, and only a select few knew the true nature of what was being contained. But as time passed, these protections had weakened, and the abbey had slowly begun to fall into disrepair. The nuns, unaware of the growing danger, had arrived at the abbey full of hope and devotion, eager to dedicate their lives to serving God. But they had unknowingly walked into a place that had already been tainted by the very forces they had sworn to fight against. The deeper the investigators delved, the more they began to see the connection between the strange events and the abbey's history. The nuns had been trapped in a cycle, a repeating pattern of spiritual devotion and terrifying discovery. The land itself seemed to demand a sacrifice, and the nuns had unwittingly become part of that ritual. Their devotion to God had drawn them into a struggle they could not comprehend, a struggle that had played out in secret for centuries. As the investigators sifted through the letters, the diaries, and the old records, they began to see the full scope of the nuns' terror. They had not just been afraid for their lives. They had been afraid for the very souls of everyone around them. They had felt the weight of the ancient power pressing in on them, a pressure that threatened to crush them all. And in their final, desperate attempt to protect the town, they had hidden away, sealing themselves off in the world, hoping that the darkness would pass them by. But the darkness did not pass. Instead, it grew stronger, and the town, once blissfully ignorant of the horrors that lay beneath the abbey, began to feel the effects of the ancient power. People started to have strange dreams, visions of shadowy figures and cryptic messages. The whispers that the nuns had written about in their letters began to reach the ears of the townspeople, who felt an overwhelming sense of dread but could not explain why. The air seemed to grow thicker, as if something unseen was closing in, something that had been dormant for centuries but was now stirring, waking up from its long slumber. The investigators, now fully aware of the danger they were facing, realized that they could not simply uncover the truth and walk away. The power that had been contained within the abbey was not something that could be easily dismissed. It had been built into the very foundation of the land, woven into the stones, and it would not be easily banished. The nuns had tried, and they had failed. The town, too, was beginning to feel the pull of the darkness. The more the investigators uncovered, the more they realized that the only way to stop the force from spreading was to confront it directly, to face it head-on and risk everything. But how could they confront something that had existed for centuries, something so deeply entrenched in the land itself? The document suggested that the key to containing the force lay within the abbey's very walls, in the secret rooms and hidden chambers that had been sealed off for so long. These places, the investigators realized, were not just hiding physical relics or old texts. They were holding the very essence of the power that had been contained for centuries. The nuns had known this. They had known that their seclusion was not just a retreat from the world. It was a desperate attempt to contain the darkness and prevent it from consuming everything in its path. As the investigators made their final preparations to confront the darkness that had been unleashed, the air in the abbey grew heavier. The walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing longer with each passing minute. The fear that had once been so palpable in the nuns' letters now felt real, felt tangible. The abbey itself seemed to breathe, to pulse with a life of its own, as if the land were alive, watching, waiting for the moment when it could break free. The town, too, seemed to sense the growing tension. People spoke in hushed voices, glancing nervously over their shoulders as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. The investigators knew that they had reached a point of no return. The truth had been uncovered, but it had come at a cost. They could not undo what had been done, could not turn back time and erase the ancient power that had been disturbed. The only thing left to do was confront the darkness head-on and hope that they could contain it once again before it consumed everything in its path. But even as they prepared to face the force that had been locked away for so long, they knew that there was no guarantee of success. The power that lay beneath the abbey was not something that could be easily controlled, and the cost of confronting it could very well be their lives. As they gathered in the heart of the abbey, ready to face the unknown, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. The town, once peaceful and unsuspecting, now stood on the brink of a new reality, a reality where the past, the darkness, and the unknown all collided. The investigators, bracing themselves for what was to come, could only hope that they had uncovered enough of the truth to stop the force that had been awakened from consuming them all. The tension inside the abbey had reached a fever pitch, as if every stone, every shadow, was charged with silent, ominous energy. The investigators had uncovered the truth, But even they knew that the real battle was only just beginning. They were no longer simply searching for answers about the missing nuns or the strange occurrences that had plagued the abbey for years. They were now fighting to stop something far more insidious, an ancient, dark power that had been sealed away for centuries, now threatening to break free. The town, once ignorant of the horrors hidden within the abbey's walls, now found itself on the precipice of reality they had never imagined. Strange occurrences were becoming more frequent. People spoke of feeling watched, of hearing whispers in the wind, of seeing fleeting shadows in their peripheral vision, disturbing signs that the darkness was beginning to stir once again. The once peaceful streets, once bathed in the warm glow of sunlight, now felt suffused with an unease that was impossible to shake. It was as if the very land had begun to warp, as though something deep beneath the earth was pushing against the surface, yearning to break through. Inside the abbey, the investigators gathered in what had once been the nuns' most sacred space, the chapel. Now that space had become a battlefield, a place where faith, fear, and the unknown collided. The walls, which had once echoed with prayers and hymns, now seemed to absorb every breath, every whispered word. The investigators, standing in the shadows of the chapel, knew that they had reached the heart of the mystery, the answer to everything. The nuns' disappearance, the darkness lurking beneath the abbey, was somewhere here, hidden in plain sight, waiting for them to uncover it. They had discovered the ancient order's writings, the rituals that had been performed in secret, and the records that detailed the pacts made long ago. But even with all the knowledge they had gained, they knew that understanding the past was not enough to stop the present danger. The ancient force that had once been contained had now been awakened, and its power was growing with every passing day. It was as though the land itself was pulsing with this energy, waiting for the right moment to surge forth and consume everything in its path. The nuns, in their final moment of clarity, had written of the growing power within the abbey, of the oppressive feeling that had begun to fill every corner of the building. They had spoken of the land's ancient curse, of the rituals that had been performed to keep it contained, and of the price that had been paid to ensure that the power did not escape. But they had also written of their fear not only for themselves but for the town they had vowed to protect. They had known that the darkness was not something that could be ignored, and they had made the difficult decision to seal themselves away in an effort to contain it. But now, with the passage of time and the decay of the abbey's physical structure, it was clear that their efforts had not been enough. The abbey's architecture, designed to hold the power within its walls, had begun to falter. The hidden chambers, once sealed and protected by generations of nuns, were now beginning to reveal their secrets. The land itself was shifting, as if the power beneath it was growing restless, struggling to break free of the restraints that had been placed on it. Every crack in the stone, every creaking beam, seemed to be a sign that the force that had been held at bay for so long was now stirring, stretching, testing its limits. The investigators, led by the few historians and experts who had managed to make sense of the ancient texts and rituals, had formulated a plan. They would need to find the source of the power, the heart of the darkness, and contain it before it consumed everything. They knew that this would be no simple task. The power that had been contained within the abbey was not a mere superstition or a passing threat. It was an ancient, primal force, one that had been buried for centuries beneath layers of faith, ritual, and stone. It had survived all this time, biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to break free. The plan was risky, but it was their only option. The heart of the darkness, they believed, lay deep beneath the abbey, in a hidden crypt that had never been uncovered. The records they had found spoke of this crypt, though it had been forgotten for generations. It was said to be a place where the power had been sealed away, a chamber built deep into the earth, far below the abbey's foundations. The ritual to contain the power had been performed there, and it was believed that the crypt held the key to keeping the force at bay. But with the abbey in disrepair and the land shifting, the crypt was no longer as secure as it had once been. If the investigators were to stand a chance of containing the darkness, they would need to find this crypt and perform the ritual once more. The search for the crypt was fraught with danger. The investigators descended into the lower levels of the abbey, into the ancient catacombs that stretched beneath the building like a labyrinth. These underground passages, long forgotten by the inhabitants of the abbey, were filled with a suffocating stillness, a silence that seemed to press in on them from all sides. As they ventured deeper, the air grew colder, the walls more oppressive. It was as though they were being drawn into the heart of the darkness itself. The closer they came to their goal,